The dust hung thick in the air as Catherine Matthews clutched the foreclosure notice with trembling hands, the banker's words still ringing in her ears. 7 days to settle her father's debts or lose everything. The small ranch outside of Silver Creek, Arizona Territory, 1878, the only home she had ever known would be auctioned to the highest bidder, and she would have nowhere to go. "I'm sorry, Miss Matthews," Mr. Holloway had said, not looking sorry at all as he adjusted his spectacles. "Business is business. Your father borrowed heavily this past year, and with his passing, well..." He'd offered a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps you have relatives back east." Catherine had no one. Her mother had died of fever when she was 12, and her father's heart had given out just 3 months ago, leaving her alone with a drought-stricken ranch, dwindling cattle, and a mountain of debt she couldn't hope to repay. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as she slowly made her way back to the small porch, sinking down onto the wooden steps. At 23, she had been managing the ranch alongside her father for years, but the drought had been merciless. They'd lost nearly half their herd, and with her father gone, the hired hands had moved on to more promising employment. "Miss Catherine." She looked up to see Mrs. Abernathy, their elderly neighbor, approaching with a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "I brought you some fresh bread and preserves," the old woman said, her face creased with concern. "You look like you haven't eaten in days, child." Catherine forced a smile. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Abernathy, but I couldn't—" "Nonsense," the woman interrupted, settling the basket beside her. "Tell me what that weasel Holloway said." Catherine's eyes welled with tears as she explained the situation. Mrs. Abernathy's lips pressed into a thin line. "That man has been waiting to get his hands on your land since your daddy first took ill. Says there's silver in the hills behind your property." "What?" Catherine's head snapped up. "That can't be right. Father would have known." "Your father was a good man, but not much for prospecting," Mrs. Abernathy said gently. "Folks have been whispering about it for months now. That's why Holloway's been so eager to call in those loans." A flicker of anger ignited in Catherine's chest, but it quickly died. What did it matter if there was silver or not? She had no money to hire miners, no way to prove it, and only a week before she lost everything anyway. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice small. Mrs. Abernathy patted her hand. "You'll figure something out, dear. You always do." But as the older woman hobbled back down the path toward her own homestead, Catherine knew there was no solution to be found. She couldn't pay her debts. She couldn't save her home. And in a week's time, she would have nothing left of her family except memories. The following morning, Catherine was mending a fence in the north pasture when she heard the approach of hoofbeats. Shielding her eyes from the sun, she saw a lone rider coming toward her, his silhouette unfamiliar. Her hand instinctively moved to the small revolver tucked in her waistband. Her father had insisted she learn to shoot, and she was grateful for it now. As the rider drew closer, she could make out a tall man with broad shoulders, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, seemed almost as weary as its rider. "Morning, madam," he called, raising a hand in greeting. "Don't mean to startle you. Name's Owen Blackwood. I'm looking for work and a place to water my horse if you can spare it." Catherine hesitated, studying him. His clothes were dusty but well kept, his saddle of good quality though weathered by the elements. He had the look of a man who'd spent years on the trail's sun-browned skin, lines around his eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and a certain watchfulness that came from hard-earned caution. "I'm afraid I can't offer you work, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, lowering her hand from her gun but keeping it within reach. "The ranch is not doing well, But there's a stream just beyond those cottonwoods where your horse can drink." He nodded his thanks and dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Leading his horse toward the stream, he glanced back at her. "You running this place alone, Miss Matthews, Catherine Matthews, and yes, I am." She lifted her chin, daring him to comment on the impropriety of a woman managing a ranch by herself. Instead, he simply nodded again. "That's a hard row to hoe, Miss Matthews. My respects." There was something in his eyes, not pity, but a genuine understanding that caught her off guard. She found herself explaining, "My father passed away recently. I'm trying to keep things going, but—" She gestured to the poorly mended fence, the overgrown pasture beyond. "Mind if I take a look at that fence while my horse rests?" he asked, removing his gloves. "Least I can do for the water." Before she could protest, he was examining her handiwork, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness over the splintered wood. "You've got the right idea," he said, "but if you brace it here instead." He demonstrated, and Catherine had to admit his method was more stable than hers. "Where are you headed, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked as they worked side by side to fix the section of fence. "Nowhere in particular," he replied, driving a stake into the ground with powerful strikes of her hammer. "Been drifting since the war. Worked cattle drives in Texas, did some prospecting in Colorado, broke horses in Wyoming." He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "Just keeping moving, I suppose." "The war's been over for 13 years, she observed quietly. His eyes met hers briefly. "Some things stay with a man." They worked in companionable silence after that, finishing the fence repair in half the time it would have taken Catherine alone. As they walked back toward the house, Owen Blackwood seemed to notice the state of disrepair: the sagging porch, the peeling paint, the empty corral where once a dozen horses would have stood. "You mentioned things aren't going well," he said carefully. "I don't mean to pry, but is there anything I can help with before I move on? I'm handy with most ranch work." Catherine hesitated. There was something reassuring about this quiet, capable stranger, but pride held her tongue. "That's kind of you, but as I said, I can't pay for help right now." He shrugged. "Wasn't asking for payment. Just a meal and maybe a spot in your barn for the night. Been sleeping under the stars for weeks now, and a roof would be welcome." She considered his offer. An extra pair of hands, even for a day, could help with the most pressing repairs. And there was something about Owen Blackwood that didn't set off the warnings her father had taught her to heed with strangers. "All right," she agreed. "I can offer you supper and the barn, and there's plenty of work to be done if you're serious." His smile transformed his weathered face, revealing a warmth that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "I'm always serious about work, Miss Matthews." That evening, after a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and the last of Mrs. Abernathy's preserves, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Catherine found herself telling this stranger about her father, the drought, and finally, the foreclosure notice. 7 days, she concluded, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. "Then it all goes to auction, and Mr. Holloway will probably buy it for a fraction of what it's worth." Owen was quiet for a long moment, rolling a cigarette between his fingers but not lighting it. "This Holloway, he's the banker," Catherine nodded. "He's been trying to get this land for years. Mrs. Abernathy says there might be silver in the hills behind the property." "Is that so?" Owen's expression turned thoughtful. "You ever look into that?" She shook her head. "Father always said mining was a fool's game, too many broken dreams. Besides, even if there is silver, I'd need money to find it, and money is exactly what I don't have." Owen leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the darkening hills. "Sometimes a man or woman has to take a gamble, Miss Matthews." Some gambles are too steep, she replied softly. And please call me Catherine. After I told you my life story, Miss Matthews seems overly formal, he smiled. Catherine, then, and I'm Owen. As night fell, Catherine showed him to the barn, providing blankets and a lantern. Standing in the doorway, she found herself reluctant to leave. There was something comforting about his presence, something that made her feel less alone than she had in months. "Thank you for your help today," she said, "and for listening." "My pleasure, Catherine." He hesitated, then added, "If you don't mind, I'd like to stay on a few days, help out where I can." She wanted to refuse, to maintain the last shreds of her independence, but practicality won out. "I'd appreciate that," she admitted, "though I still can't pay you." "Wasn't asking for payment," he reminded her with a gentle smile. "Get some rest now. Tomorrow's another day." As Catherine walked back to the silent house, she realized she hadn't felt this spark of hope since before her father fell ill. It wouldn't last, nothing could change the reality of her situation. But for tonight, at least, she wasn't facing it alone. The next morning, Catherine woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of hammering. Dressing quickly, she found Owen on the porch, repairing the loose boards she'd been meaning to fix for weeks. "Hope I didn't wake you," he said, pausing his work. "Coffee's hot if you want some." She accepted the tin cup he offered, surprised by the rich aroma. "This isn't my coffee." He looked slightly embarrassed. "I always carry good coffee beans, one of my few luxuries on the trail. Thought you might appreciate a decent cup." "I do," she said, taking a sip and closing her eyes in appreciation. "Thank you." Over the next 3 days, Owen worked from sunrise to sunset, repairing fences, patching the roof, cleaning out the well, and even breaking the one wild stallion left in her corral, a task Catherine had been avoiding since her father's death. The animal had been her father's pride, but too dangerous for her to handle alone. By the 4th day, Catherine found herself watching Owen as he worked, noticing things beyond his capability and strength: the gentleness with which he spoke to the horses, the respect in his voice when he mentioned her father's craftsmanship, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. That evening, as they sat on the newly repaired porch, Catherine realized with a pang that in 3 more days, none of this would matter. The repairs, the momentary reprieve, it would all be lost when Holloway took possession of the ranch. "You've gone quiet," Owen observed, rolling his customary evening cigarette between his fingers. "Just thinking about what happens next," she admitted. "After." He nodded, understanding without her having to explain. "Have you considered what you'll do?" Catherine shook her head. "Mrs. Abernathy offered me a room, but she can barely feed herself. I could try for work in town, but—" She trailed off, knowing the limited options for a single woman in a place like Silver Creek. Owen was silent for so long that Catherine thought he might not respond. Finally, he set aside his unlit cigarette and turned to face her fully. "I have a proposition for you, Catherine," he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of tension she hadn't heard before. "Not charity, but an arrangement that might benefit us both." She raised an eyebrow, instantly wary. "What kind of arrangement?" "Marriage," he said simply. Catherine stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon, a marriage of convenience," he clarified quickly. "If you were married, the bank would have to deal with your husband regarding the debts. It would buy time at the very least." "And why would you offer such a thing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Owen looked out at the darkening land, his profile strong against the evening sky. "I've been drifting a long time, Catherine. Too long, maybe. I've seen enough of the world to know a good piece of land when I see it, and enough of people to recognize someone worth partnering with." He turned back to her, his eyes serious. "I have some savings, not enough to clear the debt entirely, but enough to negotiate terms." Combined with the possibility of silver in those hills, it might be enough to keep Holloway at bay while we find a more permanent solution. Catherine's mind raced. Marriage to a man she'd known less than a week a stranger, really, despite the easy way they'd fallen into working together. It was madness, and yet. "This isn't about taking advantage," Owen continued, seeming to read her thoughts. "We'd be partners, plain and simple. You know the land, I know ranching. Together we might just save this place." He paused. "And if we don't suit, or if you change your mind once the crisis has passed, I'll go my way with no hard feelings." "You're proposing a temporary marriage?" she asked, trying to understand. "I'm proposing a partnership that begins with marriage," he corrected gently. "Whether it remains temporary would be for us to decide together down the road." Catherine stood, needing to move to think. "This is unexpected." "I know," he acknowledged, remaining seated to give her space. "And I don't need an answer tonight. Think on it. But know that the offer comes with no expectations beyond those of a business partner." Later that night, lying in her bed staring at the ceiling, Catherine turned Owen's proposition over in her mind. Marriage had never been a priority for her. She'd been too busy helping her father run the ranch, and the few suitors who'd shown interest over the years had been put off by her independence and capability. Owen was different. He seemed to respect her strength rather than be threatened by it. And in the short time she'd known him, he'd shown himself to be honorable, hardworking, and kind. But marriage? To save the ranch, yes, she would consider it. But what of after? What kind of partnership could grow from such desperate beginnings? Morning came with no clear answer. But as Catherine watched Owen chopping wood in the early light, his movements efficient and powerful, she felt a strange certainty settle over her. Whatever came of this arrangement, she trusted this man more than she had any right to, given their brief acquaintance. After breakfast, she found him repairing a saddle on the porch, his large hands deftly working the leather. "Yes," she said simply, standing before him. Owen looked up, his hands stilling. "Yes, to your proposition," Catherine clarified, "if you're still offering." He set aside the saddle and stood, facing her with a solemnity that matched the moment. "I am. Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be given the circumstances," she replied honestly, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "This is a partnership," she stated firmly. "The ranch remains in both our names. All decisions about its management are made together." Owen nodded. "Agreed." "And—" She hesitated, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "Regarding the marital aspects." "Those can wait," he said quietly. "For as long as you need. This arrangement is about saving your home, Catherine. Nothing more is expected." Relief and something else, disappointment, fluttered in her chest. "Then we have an agreement, Mr. Blackwood." "Owen," he reminded her with a small smile, "if we're to be married, you should use my given name." "Owen," she repeated, surprised by how natural it felt on her lips. They rode into Silver Creek that afternoon, an odd tension between them that hadn't existed before. The town was small but bustling, with a main street lined by a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and the imposing brick building that housed Holloway's bank. The justice of the peace, a weathered old man named Judge Wilson, raised his eyebrows at their request for an immediate marriage, but asked no questions beyond the necessary legalities. With Mrs. Abernathy, summoned hastily when they passed her homestead, and the general store owner as witnesses, Catherine Matthews became Catherine Blackwood in a ceremony that took less than 5 minutes. "Well, that's done," Judge Wilson said, closing his book. "May you find happiness together." He peered at them over his spectacles. "Though I'd advise a proper church ceremony when time permits, for the sake of appearances." Catherine nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what she'd just done. She was married, to a man she barely knew. a man who now stood beside her as her husband. Mrs. Abernathy squeezed her hand. "Your father would understand, dear," she whispered. "He'd want you to be taken care of." Owen paid the judge, his movements calm as if he hadn't just upended his entire life for a woman and a piece of land he'd known for less than a week. Catherine watched him, wondering again what had truly motivated his offer. Their next stop was the bank, where Mr. Holloway's smug expression faltered at the sight of them entering together. "Miss Matthews," he began, then corrected himself with a frown. "Mrs. Blackwood, I presume? News travels fast in small towns." "Indeed it does," Catherine replied coolly. "My husband and I are here to discuss the matter of my father's loans." Holloway's gaze shifted to Owen, assessing. "I'm afraid the matter is quite settled. The foreclosure proceeds in 3 days unless the full amount is paid." Owen stepped forward, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard. "I understand business, Mr. Holloway, but I also understand negotiation. My wife's father was a valued member of this community, and I believe there's room for discussion regarding terms." "The terms are quite clear, as is my intention to examine the loan documents in detail," Owen interrupted smoothly. "As Catherine's husband, I have that right, and should I find any irregularities in how interest was calculated or terms were presented to a grieving daughter, well," he smiled without warmth, "that might become a matter of broader interest to the community." Holloway's face flushed. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwood?" "Not at all," Owen replied. "I'm simply suggesting we approach this as businessmen. I have funds to make a substantial payment toward the principal. In return, I propose you extend the terms on the remaining balance." Catherine watched in amazement as Owen and Holloway engaged in a tense negotiation that ended with Holloway grudgingly agreeing to accept Owen's payment and restructure the loan with a 6-month grace period before the next payment would be due. "This is highly irregular," Holloway muttered as he prepared the new documents. "So is trying to seize land you believe contains silver without informing the owners of its potential value." Owen replied casually. Holloway's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Owen said. "Just making conversation. Now, shall we conclude our business?" An hour later, they rode out of town with the new loan agreement secured. Catherine felt lightheaded with relief and confusion. She had a reprieve 6 months to make the ranch profitable again or find silver in those hills. And she had a husband, a virtual stranger who had just committed nearly all his savings to her cause. "How did you know what to say to him?" she asked as they rode side by side. Owen's mouth quirked. "I've dealt with men like Holloway before. They respect only 2 things, money and the threat of exposure. I offered both." "And the money you paid him, that was all your savings, wasn't it?" he shrugged. "Most of it. But it's a good investment if there's silver in those hills." "And if there isn't, then we build back the ranch the old-fashioned way," he said simply. "Hard work and time." Catherine studied his profile, this man who was now legally her husband. "Why did you really do this, Owen? The truth?" He was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the trail ahead. "Maybe I've been alone too long," he finally said. "Maybe I saw something here worth staying for." His eyes met hers briefly. "Or someone." The words hung between them as they continued toward home, their home now, Catherine realized with a strange flutter in her chest. That evening, the reality of their new arrangement settled over them like an awkward blanket. Owen insisted on sleeping in the barn despite his new status as her husband, and Catherine was both relieved and oddly disappointed. Standing in the doorway of her bedroom, her parents' bedroom once, and now technically hers and Owen's, she felt the weight of the day's events pressing down on her. She was no longer just Catherine Matthews, struggling to save her father's legacy. She was Catherine Blackwood, with a partner in that struggle. A husband. Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams filled with silver streams and wedding bands and Owen's hands gently repairing broken things. The next morning established what would become their routine for the weeks ahead. They rose early, worked the ranch side by side, and in the evenings they planned. Owen's experience with cattle was extensive, and he had ideas for rebuilding the herd with hardier stock better suited to the Arizona climate. Catherine's knowledge of the land where water could be found even in drought, which pastures recovered fastest after winter, complemented his practical ranching skills. They also began exploring the hills behind the property, searching for any sign of the rumored silver. Owen had some experience with prospecting, enough to recognize promising formations and test samples for mineral content. "It's not about finding a massive vein," he explained as they examined a rocky outcropping. "Small deposits, consistently mined, can provide steady income to supplement the ranch." Catherine watched him work, his focus intense as he chipped at the rock face. In the 3 weeks since their hasty marriage, she'd learned more about his past, his childhood in Pennsylvania, his service in the Union Army during the Civil War, his years of drifting afterward, unable to settle in one place for long. "What made you keep moving?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire, maps of the property spread between them. "After the war, I mean." Owen was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the flames. "I lost my brother at Gettysburg," he finally said. "Went home after, but everything felt wrong, empty. So I headed west, thinking maybe distance would help." He shrugged. "Never found a reason to stop moving, until now." The simple statement warmed Catherine more than the fire before them. They had settled into an easy partnership during the daylight hours. But evenings brought a tension. Neither seemed willing to address the reality that they were married in name but living as cautious friends, neither crossing the invisible boundary between them. A month into their marriage, a stroke of luck changed everything. Owen, exploring a narrow ravine on the northern edge of the property, discovered a modest but promising silver deposit. It wasn't the motherlode Holloway had likely imagined, but it was enough to fund improvements to the ranch and ensure they could meet the next loan payment. "We'll need to hire men," Owen said that night, excitement making his usually calm voice animated. "Not many, just enough to work the claim properly, and we'll need equipment." Catherine nodded, caught up in his enthusiasm. "The Perkins brothers might be available. They worked for my father before the drought forced us to let them go." "Good men, the best," she confirmed. "Loyal and hardworking." Owen smiled, the firelight catching the gold flecks in his hazel eyes. "Then we'll start there. By winter, we could have both the mine and the ranch turning a profit." Impulsively, Catherine reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I never thought this was possible," she said softly. "A month ago I was about to lose everything." Owen turned his hand to clasp hers, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "We've only just begun, Catherine. There's much more to do." Something in his voice, in the way his thumb brushed lightly across her knuckles, made her breath catch. For a moment, the air between them seemed charged with possibility. Then Owen gently released her hand and stood. "It's late. We should get some rest. Tomorrow we'll be busy." Catherine nodded, both disappointed and relieved at the return to their established boundaries. "Good night, Owen." "Good night, Catherine." As he headed toward the door and his continued residence in the barn, Catherine found herself calling after him. "Owen," he paused, turning back. "Yes." The words she wanted to say caught in her throat. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for everything." His smile was gentle, understanding. "You don't need to thank me, Catherine. This is our life now, together. Our life. Together. The words echoed in her mind long after he had gone. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of activity. The Perkins brothers, Tom and Daniel, eagerly accepted Owen's offer of employment, and with their help, work began on both the small mine and restoring the ranch to working order. Word spread quickly through Silver Creek that the Matthews place, now the Blackwood Ranch, was experiencing a revival. Mr. Holloway made a point of riding out to check on his investment, his sour expression revealing his disappointment at finding the property thriving rather than failing. "Quite a turnaround, Mrs. Blackwood," he observed, eyeing the repaired-out buildings and the small herd of cattle Owen had purchased at auction in Tucson. "Your husband seems to have brought you luck." "Hard work, not luck," Catherine corrected pleasantly. "Though I am fortunate in my choice of partner." Holloway's eyes narrowed. "Indeed. Curious, isn't it, how a drifter with no ties to the community appeared just when you needed him most? One might wonder what brought him to Silver Creek at all." "One might," Catherine agreed, maintaining her smile with effort. "Just as one might wonder why a banker would be so interested in foreclosing on a supposedly worthless piece of land. Good day, Mr. Holloway." As he rode away, Owen appeared from the barn, his expression troubled. "What did Holloway want? To stir up doubt," Catherine replied, still watching the banker's retreating figure. "He implied there was something suspicious about your arrival here." Owen's jaw tightened. "Did he now?" "It doesn't matter," she assured him quickly. "He's just angry that his plan to acquire the property cheaply has failed." But later that night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a habit that had become one of Catherine's favorite parts of the day, she found herself wondering about Owen's past. Not the parts he'd shared, but the silences between his stories, the years unaccounted for. "What is it?" Owen asked, noticing her pensive mood. "You've been quiet all evening." Catherine hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Holloway made me realize how little I know about you." "About what brought you here?" Owen was silent for a long moment, rolling his ever-present cigarette between his fingers. "Are you asking if I had ulterior motives in stopping at your ranch that day?" "No," she said quickly, then amended, "maybe. It's just sometimes it seems too fortuitous, your arrival just when I needed help most." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than offended. "I understand why you'd wonder." He finally lit his cigarette, taking a deep draw before continuing. "The truth is simpler than whatever Holloway might imply. I was heading toward California, thinking I might try my luck there. Your ranch was on my path, and I needed water for my horse." He looked out at the darkening landscape. "But when I saw you, this woman alone, fighting to save something she loved against impossible odds, something in me responded. I recognized your determination, your grit. It reminded me of—" He trailed off. "Of what?" Catherine prompted gently. "Of who I used to be," he finished quietly. "Before the war, before I lost my way." His eyes met hers. "I stayed because I wanted to help. I offered marriage because it seemed the most practical solution. But I've remained because, for the first time in years, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be." The simple honesty of his words moved Catherine deeply. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I'm glad you stayed," she whispered. Owen's eyes darkened as he looked at their joined hands, then up at her face. For a breathless moment, Catherine thought he might lean in, might bridge the careful distance they'd maintained. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently and released it. "It's getting late," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "We should turn in." That night, lying in her bed, Catherine acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding for weeks. She was falling in love with her husband of convenience. The question was, did he feel the same? The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Catherine was hanging laundry when she spotted a rider approaching a woman, to her surprise. As the figure drew closer, Catherine recognized Mabel Turner, the town's seamstress and notorious gossip. "Mrs. Blackwood," Mabel called, waving enthusiastically as she reined her horse to a stop. "I've come with wonderful news." Catherine greeted her with cautious politeness, wondering what could possibly have brought Mabel all the way out to the ranch. "The Ladies' Aid Society is hosting a harvest dance next Saturday," Mabel announced, her eyes bright with excitement. "And we insist you and your husband attend. It will be your first social event as a married couple, and everyone is simply dying to meet the man who swept you off your feet so quickly." Catherine managed a smile, though her stomach knotted at the thought of parading their unusual arrangement before the entire town. "How kind of you to ride all this way to invite us. I'll have to discuss it with Owen, of course." "Discuss what?" Owen's voice came from behind her as he emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Catherine made the introductions, watching as Mabel openly assessed Owen with appreciative eyes. "My goodness," the seamstress said with a coy smile. "Catherine has been keeping you all to herself, Mr. Blackwood. You simply must both come to the dance. It would be most irregular for newlyweds to decline their first social invitation." Owen glanced at Catherine, a question in his eyes. When she gave a slight nod, he turned back to Mabel with an easy smile. "We'd be delighted to attend, Mrs. Turner." "Thank you for the invitation." After Mabel departed, clearly pleased with herself, Catherine sighed. "I'm sorry about that. We don't have to go if you'd rather not." Owen shrugged. "Might be good for us to be seen together in town, establish ourselves as a proper married couple." "Right," Catherine agreed, ignoring the twinge of disappointment at his practical response. "For appearances." The day of the dance arrived with unexpected nervousness on Catherine's part. She found herself fretting over her appearance for the first time in years, finally settling on her best dress, a deep blue calico that her father had always said matched her eyes. When she emerged from the bedroom, Owen was waiting in the main room, dressed in a clean shirt and his best trousers, his hair neatly combed. He had even trimmed his beard, revealing more of the strong line of his jaw. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You look beautiful, Catherine," he finally said, his voice low. Heat rose to her cheeks. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." The ride to town was quiet, both seemingly lost in their own thoughts. The dance was being held in the newly constructed town hall, which had been decorated with autumn leaves and harvest bounty. It seemed all of Silver Creek had turned out for the event, and Catherine felt dozens of eyes turned toward them as they entered, ready to face the lions. Owen murmured, offering his arm. Catherine smiled up at him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Together," she replied, placing her hand on his arm. The evening progressed better than Catherine had feared. While there were certainly curious glances and whispered conversations, most people were welcoming. Owen charmed the older ladies with his respectful manner, impressed the men with his knowledge of cattle and mining, and generally presented himself as exactly what he appeared to be, a hard-working man devoted to his new wife and their shared property. When the band struck up a waltz, Owen turned to Catherine with a slightly nervous smile. "Would you care to dance, Mrs. Blackwood?" The formal address, spoken with a warmth that belied its propriety, made her heart skip. "I would, Mr. Blackwood." As he led her onto the floor, one hand at her waist and the other clasping hers, Catherine realized this was the closest they had ever been. His hand was warm through the fabric of her dress, his movements sure as he guided her through the steps. "I didn't know you could dance," she said, looking up at him. "There's a lot you don't know about me yet," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. But we have time. The simple statement, the yet that implied a future together, made Catherine's breath catch. As they moved around the floor, she became increasingly aware of Owen, the clean scent of him, the strength in the arm that held her, the way his eyes never left her face. When the music ended, he didn't immediately release her. For a moment, they stood still amid the swirl of other couples, connected by more than just their clasped hands. Then someone bumped into them, breaking the spell, and Owen stepped back. But something had shifted between them. Some invisible barrier weakened. Later, as they prepared to leave, Catherine found herself cornered by Mabel Turner and several other ladies from the Aid Society. "Such a handsome husband," Mabel gushed, "and so clearly devoted to you. The way he looks at you when you're not watching well, it's enough to make a woman swoon." Catherine blinked in surprise. "The way he looks at me?" Another woman, Mrs. Peterson, nodded enthusiastically. "Like you hung the moon and stars, dear. I told my Herbert he could take lessons from your Owen on how to gaze adoringly at one's wife." Before Catherine could process this information, Owen appeared at her side. "Ready to head home?" he asked, his hand coming to rest lightly at the small of her back. The women exchanged knowing smiles, and Catherine felt her cheeks warm. "Yes, I think so," she replied, suddenly eager to be alone with him. The ride home was filled with a new tension, a heightened awareness that hadn't been there before. When they reached the ranch, Owen helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for tonight," Catherine said softly as they stood in the yard, the moon casting silver light over everything. "For playing the devoted husband so convincingly." Something flickered in Owen's eyes. "Who says I was playing?" Catherine's heart leapt, but before she could respond, he stepped back. "It's late," he said, his voice rough. "You should get some rest." As he turned toward the barn, Catherine found her courage. "Owen," she called. When he looked back, she continued, "We've been married for nearly 2 months now. Don't you think it's time you stopped sleeping in the barn?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then Owen slowly walked back to her, stopping close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat. "Catherine," he said, his voice low and intense, "I need you to be very clear about what you're asking, because once we—" He took a deep breath. "I won't be able to go back to the way things have been." Catherine met his gaze steadily, despite the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. "I don't want to go back," she whispered. "I want to move forward, with you, as your wife in truth, not just in name." Owen's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch achingly gentle. "Are you sure? This started as an arrangement of convenience. You don't owe me. This isn't about debt or obligation," she interrupted, leaning into his touch. "This is about what I want, what I feel." His eyes searched hers for a long moment. "And what do you feel, Catherine?" Instead of answering with words, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. But when Owen's arms came around her, pulling her against him as he deepened the kiss, all hesitation vanished. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the first week I knew you," he admitted. Catherine smiled, her heart feeling too full for her chest. "What took you so long?" "I was waiting for you," he said simply. "Waiting to be sure you wanted me for more than just the safety I could provide." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "I want you, Owen Blackwood, the man who fixed my fences and saved my home and looked at me like I was worth staying for." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "You are worth everything." That night, Owen did not return to the barn. Instead, he followed Catherine into the house, into the bedroom that was now truly theirs, and showed her with gentle hands and whispered words exactly how much she meant to him. Afterward, lying in his arms as moonlight streamed through the window, Catherine felt a peace she hadn't known since before her father's illness. "I never expected this," she murmured against Owen's chest. "When you first rode up that day, I never imagined we'd end up here." His arms tightened around her. "Regrets?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. She raised her head to look at him, taking in the vulnerability in his eyes that he rarely allowed anyone to see. "Not a single one," she assured him, "except perhaps that we waited so long for this." His smile was slow and sweet as he pulled her back down to him. "We have time to make up for that," he promised, his lips finding hers again. As autumn gave way to winter, the Blackwood Ranch continued to flourish. The small silver mine provided steady income, enough to make the loan payments with some left over for improvements to the property. Owen's experience with cattle proved invaluable as they slowly rebuilt the herd with carefully selected stock that would thrive in the harsh Arizona climate. More significant than the external changes, however, was the transformation of their marriage. What had begun as a practical arrangement blossomed into a deep and genuine love, evident in the way they worked together during the day and held each other through the long winter nights. When spring arrived, bringing new growth to the land and new calves to their expanding herd, Catherine discovered another new beginning on the horizon. She confirmed her suspicions with a visit to the town doctor, and returned home bursting with the news she could barely contain. She found Owen in the north pasture, mending a section of fence with the easy competence that still made her heart skip a beat after all these months. "There you are," he called when he spotted her, his face lighting up the way it always did when she appeared. "How was your visit to town?" Catherine dismounted and walked toward him, suddenly nervous despite her joy. "It was informative," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. Owen set down his tools, his expression turning concerned. "Everything all right, more than all right," she assured him, taking his hands in hers. "Owen, I'm going to have a baby. In the fall." For a moment he simply stared at her, shock evident in his widened eyes. Then a grin spread across his face, transforming it with such pure happiness that Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his excitement. "Catherine, that's magnificent news," she laughed as he spun her around, then set her down carefully, his hands moving to cradle her face. "Are you feeling well? Should you be riding?" "Maybe we should. I'm perfectly fine," she interrupted, amused by his sudden protectiveness. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know." "Not my wife," he said, his voice turning serious. "Not carrying my child." The possessive tenderness in his tone made her heart swell. "Our child," she corrected gently, "who will grow up here, on the land we saved together." Owen pulled her close again, one hand coming to rest tentatively on her still flat abdomen. "Our child," he agreed, wonder in his voice. "On our land." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, a ritual that had become sacred to them, both Owen turned to Catherine with an unusually solemn expression. "I've been thinking," he began, taking her hand in his, "about how we started. About the promises I made when I offered you marriage." Catherine felt a flicker of unease. "What about them?" "I told you it could be temporary," he continued. "That if you changed your mind once the crisis had passed, I would go my way with no hard feelings." She stiffened. Are you saying you want to leave?" "No." He looked horrified at the suggestion. "God, no, Catherine. The exact opposite." He squeezed her hand. "I'm saying I want to make new promises to you, real ones not born of desperation or convenience but of love and choice. Relief washed through her. What kind of promises? Owen shifted to kneel before her, still holding her hand. I promise to love you every day of my life, he said, his voice steady and sure. To be your partner in all things, to build this life with you and our child and any others who might come along. His free hand moved to rest gently on her stomach. I promise that what began as an arrangement has become the greatest blessing of my life, and I will spend the rest of my days making sure you never regret the day you said yes to a dusty cowboy who offered his name. Tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks as she leaned forward to cup his face in her hands. I could never regret that day, she whispered. It was the day my life began again. She kissed him softly. And I promise to love you, Owen Blackwood, through all the seasons of our life together. To be your partner, your friend, your lover, and the mother of your children. He rose to sit beside her again, pulling her into his arms as the last rays of sunlight gilded the land that had brought them together. Not bad for a marriage of convenience, he murmured against her hair. Catherine smiled, nestling closer to the man who had saved her home and stolen her heart. I think we've moved well beyond convenience, she replied. This is love, pure and simple. Nothing simple about it, Owen countered, tipping her face up to his, but definitely pure. His kiss was tender, a promise of the life they would continue to build together. As darkness fell over the Blackwood Ranch, Catherine reflected on how much had changed in less than a year. She had gone from the brink of losing everything to gaining more than she had ever dreamed possible: a thriving ranch, a promising future, a child on the way, and most precious of all, a husband who had offered his name when she needed it most and given his heart along with it. What had begun as a desperate gamble had transformed into the greatest love story she could have imagined, one written not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in fence posts mended side by side, in problems solved together, in the quiet strength of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. As spring turned to summer, and Catherine's body changed with the growing life inside her, the ranch continued to prosper under their joint management. The silver mine, while not yielding the rich veins Holloway had likely hoped for, provided steady income that allowed them to expand their operations and hire additional help as Catherine's pregnancy advanced. One evening in late August, as they sat on their porch enjoying the cooler air that came with sunset, Owen surprised Catherine with a small wooden cradle, beautifully crafted with intricate carvings along the sides. I've been working on it in secret, he explained as she ran her fingers over the smooth wood, tears welling in her eyes. Tom Perkins has been letting me use his workshop in the evenings. It's beautiful, Catherine whispered, overwhelmed by the love evident in every detail. When did you find the time? Owen shrugged, looking pleased but embarrassed by her reaction. Found the time. Some things are worth making time for. As she looked up at him, this man who had once been a stranger and was now the center of her world, Catherine felt a surge of gratitude so intense it took her breath away. I love you, she said simply, the words inadequate for the depth of her feeling but all she had to offer. He knelt beside her chair, one hand coming to rest on her rounded belly where their child grew stronger each day. And I love you, he replied, both of you. As if in response, the baby kicked against his palm, making Owen's eyes widen with delight. Strong, he observed, like his mother. Or her father, Catherine countered with a smile. Their son, Oliver James Blackwood, arrived on a crisp October morning after a long but uncomplicated labor. Catherine had insisted on having the baby at home rather than in town, with only Mrs. Abernathy and the midwife in attendance. Owen had paced anxiously outside the bedroom door until the first cry rang out, whereupon Mrs. Abernathy had ushered him in to meet his son. The sight of Owen holding Oliver for the first time, his large hands cradling the tiny bundle with infinite care, his face transformed by a mixture of awe and terror, was one Catherine knew she would carry with her always. "He's perfect," Owen whispered, his voice rough with emotion as he sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "Catherine, he's absolutely perfect." She reached out to touch their son's downy head. "He has your eyes," she observed, noting the distinctive hazel shade already visible in the newborn's alert gaze. "And your determination," Owen replied with a chuckle as the baby's tiny hand gripped his finger with surprising strength. "Look at that grip. He'll be breaking horses before he's 5. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Catherine said firmly, though she smiled at Owen's obvious pride. As winter settled over the ranch, bringing quiet days and long nights, they fell into a new rhythm shaped by Oliver's needs and their own deepening bond. The baby thrived, growing stronger and more alert with each passing week, his personality already emerging in his curious gaze and determined little frown when something displeased him. Christmas that year was unlike any Catherine had experienced before. Owen insisted on cutting down a small pine from the hills behind their property, setting it up in the corner of the main room, and decorating it with paper stars and dried berries. He presented Catherine with a silver locket containing a tiny portrait of Oliver on one side and himself on the other, while she gave him a fine new saddle she had ordered months before from a craftsman in Tucson. But the greatest gift was the one they shared. The family they had created from the most unexpected beginning, the love that had grown from pragmatism to passion, the home they had saved together and filled with laughter and hope. On New Year's Eve, with Oliver sleeping soundly in his cradle and the fire crackling in the hearth, Owen pulled Catherine into his arms for a slow dance to no music but the rhythm of their hearts. "Happy New Year, Mrs. Blackwood," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Happy New Year, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, resting her head against his chest. "The first of many." He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "Any regrets about how this all began?" Catherine shook her head. "Not one. How could I regret the best decision I ever made?" "Even though you married a stranger to save your ranch?" His tone was light, but she could hear the genuine question beneath. "I married a good man who became the love of my life," she corrected. "And yes, it started with a practical arrangement, but look what grew from it." She gestured to their home, to the cradle where their son slept peacefully, to the land beyond that was flourishing under their care. "Everything that matters to me is here, with you." Owen's smile was slow and sweet as he drew her close again. "When I rode onto your property that day, I was just looking for water and maybe a day's work," he admitted. "I never imagined I'd find a home, a family, a reason to stop drifting. And now," Catherine asked softly, "now I can't imagine being anywhere else," he replied, "or with anyone else. You and Oliver, you're everything to me." As midnight approached, they stood together at the window, watching as the first snow of the new year began to fall, blanketing their land in pristine white. "You know what I wish for this year?" Catherine asked, leaning back against Owen's solid warmth. "What's that?" "More of this," she said simply. "More days working side by side, more evenings watching the sunset from our porch, more nights falling asleep in your arms, more moments watching Oliver grow." She turned in his embrace to face him. "More of the life we've built together." Owen's eyes darkened as he bent to kiss her, a kiss that held all the promise of the future stretching before them. "That," he said when they finally broke apart, "is a wish I plan to make come true." And as the new year dawned over the Blackwood Ranch, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that it would. What had begun as a desperate solution to an impossible problem had transformed into the greatest blessing of her life, a true partnership forged in adversity and tempered by love, as enduring as the land they called home. 10 years later, Catherine stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching as Owen taught their son Oliver to rope a practice post while their twin daughters, Anne and Elizabeth, aged 7, cheered from the corral fence. The sight never failed to fill her heart with joy. Her husband, still as strong and capable as the day he'd ridden onto her land, patiently guiding their children with the same gentle firmness he'd always shown. The Blackwood Ranch had prospered beyond anything they could have imagined on that desperate day when Owen had first offered his name. The silver mine had provided steady income for years before eventually playing out, but by then they had established one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. Their careful breeding program had produced stock particularly well suited to the harsh Arizona climate, and ranchers came from as far as Texas to purchase Blackwood cattle. Mr. Holloway had long since retired, bitter at having lost his chance at the silver but unable to do anything about it. Silver Creek had grown into a proper town with a school where Anne and Elizabeth were among the best students and a church where the Blackwood family occupied the same pew each Sunday. "Mama, look," Oliver called excitedly as his rope settled around the post. "I did it. Wonderful job." Catherine called back, smiling at the pride on both her son's and husband's faces. Owen ruffled Oliver's dark hair, so like his own. "You'll be out ropping your old man before long," he said with a grin. As the lesson continued, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The marriage that had begun as a business arrangement had deepened into a love so profound. It still took her breath away at unexpected moments like now, watching Owen's patient hands guiding their sons, seeing the same strength and gentleness that had rebuilt her world when it was crumbling around her. That evening, after the children were asleep, Catherine and Owen sat in their customary spot on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. "You ever think about it?" Catherine asked, her head resting against Owen's shoulder. "How differently things might have turned out if you hadn't stopped here that day?" Owen's arm tightened around her. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at you and the children, at everything we've built together, and I can't imagine any other path." She turned to study his face, still handsome despite the lines time had etched around his eyes and mouth. No regrets about settling down with a woman who couldn't pay her debts. He laughed softly, leaning in to kiss her with the same tenderness that still made her heart race after all these years. "The only debt in this marriage," he murmured against her lips, "is the one I owe to whatever fate led me to your door that day." As darkness fell over the land they had saved and nurtured together, Catherine Blackwood nestled closer to the husband who had once been a stranger and was now the other half of her soul. Their story, which had begun with a practical offer made in desperate times, had blossomed into something rare and precious, a true partnership built on respect, strengthened by challenges, and sustained by a love that grew deeper with each passing year. "I love you, Owen Blackwood," she whispered, the words as true now as they had been the first time she'd spoken them. His answering smile was visible even in the gathering darkness. "And I love you, Catherine Blackwood, yesterday, today, and all the days to come."